I'm back in Visual Studio Code, the IDE I'll use throughout this course, and this is again a totally empty folder. I only got my git ignore file in there because I will use version management here. Git, you don't need to use that at all. If it doesn't tell you anything, you can just ignore that. You don't need that git ignore file. So I have an empty folder. And again, I will now create a new file with Command N or by pressing this icon here. And this file can have any name you want, but often you name it server.js or app.js because it is the root file that makes up your Node.js application, so the Node.js code you will execute on a computer in the cloud on a server in the end. So I'll name it app.js here. Now in this file, I want to create a server through Node.js. Thus far in the first module, we only saw how we can work with the file system. So how can we now spin up such a server? We again need to import some functionality because the way JavaScript works, both in the browser and Node.js, there is a handful of functions and objects we can use globally without importing anything into that file. But generally, most functionalities aren't available by default. To not pollute our global namespace with all these reserved keywords and names basically, and also to make it very obvious in each file on which functionalities this file depends. And thus far, this file does not depend on anything. Now, there are a couple of core modules Node.js ships with, and as you will learn throughout the course, you can also install third-party modules which do not ship with Node. But let's stick to the core modules for now. Here are a handful of them. Now, not all core modules, just some. And as you can see, there is fs, which we already used thus far. There also is path, which helps us with constructing paths, so paths to files on a file system that work on any operating system, because Windows and Mac and Linux use different path formats. There is the OS package, which helps us with operating system relevant information and so on. And there are the two topmost packages, HTTP and HTTPS. And as you might be able to guess, these two sound very helpful when it comes to creating a server and working with HTTP requests and HTTP responses. And indeed, HTTP helps us with launching a server or also with other tasks like sending requests, because a Node app could also send a request to another server. You can have multiple servers communicate with each other. For example, you could send a request to the Google Maps API to send some coordinates and get back an address. But that's just an example. Let's keep it simple here and let's focus on the launch a server aspect. HTTPS would be helpful when we want to launch a SSL encoded server, so where all the data which is transferred is encrypted. And as I mentioned earlier, this is something I'll come back to towards the end of the course. Now, with that, let's use that HTTP module. And to use it, we need to import it. So we basically need to make sure that we can use features from that HTTP module, which Node.js ships with, but which still is not available globally by default. We need to make sure that we can use these features in this file. And for this, we import that functionality. We do this by creating a new constant, and you could create a var or use let too, but since we'll have some value here, which we will never change, we can also just use a const to make this really clear that we will never touch this again. We'll use it, but we'll not overwrite it. And you can give this any name you want, but typically you keep the name of the module you're importing. So I'll name this HTTP, but again, you could rename this to whatever you want. Then you have an equal sign, and now we need to assign a value. And now there's a special keyword, a special function Node.js does expose globally. So you can use it by default in any file you run via Node.js. And that is the require keyword. Now, this is simply the way you import files in Node.js. Require either takes a path to another file. You can also import your own JavaScript files, but we'll not do this for now. We'll do this heavily throughout the course though. Or if you don't have a path to one of your files, you can also import a core module like HTTP. By the way, a path to one of your files always has to start with ./ or / if it's an absolute path. / would be a relative path. So this would lead to the same folder and would now look for a HTTP file. By the way, it automatically adds .js at the end. You don't need to add it on your own, but you can. But this would now look for a local file named HTTP. If you omit / or / at the beginning, it will not look for a local file. So even if you had a file named http.js, it would not import this file. Let's get rid of it. But instead, it will always look for a global module named HTTP. And indeed, such a module exists because Node.js ships with it. So now we got this imported. And now we can start using functionalities from that global module. And you can see that if you type http dot, this is how you access functions or so-called methods and properties on objects in JavaScript. And as you can see, this HTTP object, which we import from the HTTP module, has a bunch of fields and methods we can execute. Most importantly, it has the create server method. Now, as the name suggests, this is a crucial method when it comes to, well, creating a server. And create server, actually, if we hover over it, we can see it, actually takes a so-called request listener as an argument. A request listener simply is a function that will execute for every incoming request. So let's define such a function. For this, I'll create a new function with the function keyword. We can name it however you want, RQ listener or whatever you want. The name is totally up to you. And this function has to receive 2 arguments. You can see that here if you hover over that. The request listener receives a request, which is of type incoming message, and a response object. So in short, Node.js automatically gives us some object that represents the incoming request and allows us to read data from that request. And it gives us an object, response, which we can use to return a response to whoever sent that request. So now we have to accept these 2 arguments here. And you can again name the arguments however you want. You just have to keep in mind that the first one will contain data about the request, and the second one will help you send a response. So I'll name it rec and res, and these are typical shortcuts you often see. Now this is a function, RQListener. And now we can pass this function reference, so we don't execute it, don't set these curly braces, just pass the name to that function, because this will simply tell create server, hey, please look for this function with this name and execute it for every incoming request. So this is now what we set up. This function will now run for every request that reaches our server, which will be started by calling create server, or almost. One piece is missing. I'll come back to that. Now, this is one way of doing it. Now, you don't have to explicitly create such a function, though. You can also use a so-called anonymous function. So here, you can also type function rec res like this. This is now a function without a name. That is why it's called anonymous. And it still achieves the same. We pass that function to create server, and therefore Node will execute this function whenever a request reaches our server. This is an event-driven architecture Node.js uses heavily. You work a lot with such setups or such code snippets where you tell Node if X happens, do Y. So in this case, if a request comes, please execute this function. Now, you can also use next-gen JavaScript syntax and use an arrow function where you omit the function keyword and just have the 2 arguments followed by an equal sign and a greater sign, hence an arrow, and then the function body. This is basically the equivalent to the function keyword approach. Okay, so this is our create server callback function, as it's called. It's called by Node.js whenever a request reaches our server. For now, let's simply console log the request object to see what's inside. Now, if we execute this file, we can do this in the built-in terminal, which is already navigated into this project folder. Make sure you go into that project folder if you're using the terminal outside of that IDE. So once you are in a terminal navigated in that folder, you can run node and then app.js. This will execute the app.js file, and let's see what it does. Nothing, right? We don't see console log, and that makes sense because we didn't send a request to the server, but we don't even know where the server is. How do we reach that server? Which address does it have? Well, one important thing is missing. This createServer method actually returns a server. So we have to store that in a new variable or constant. And I'll use a constant because I'll never overwrite it. I only create a server once. So now the created server is stored here. And now we can use that server and do something with it. As you can see, we get a bunch of methods we can call. And one important method is listen. Listen now actually starts a process where Node.js will not immediately exit our script, but where Node.js will instead keep this running to listen, that's why the method is named like this, for incoming requests. Now listen, as you can see, takes a couple of arguments, optional arguments. The first one is the port on which we want to listen. Now in production, you typically would not fill this out and it would take the default of port 80, but here on local development, we want to use a different port. And you can also define a host name. Now, by default, this will be the name of the machine this is running on. So for our local machine, this is localhost by default. So let's just pass a port. 3000 is a port you often use, but you're relatively free to use any port you want. The thousands port are typically pretty safe. And now with that, if we re-execute this, you see one important thing. The cursor here in the terminal doesn't go back in a new line because this process here is now still running. It didn't finish. This file execution didn't finish because we now get an ongoing looping process where this will keep on listening for requests. And this is obviously what you want, right? You want to have a web server that keeps on listening for requests. Now, we can see that in action by opening a new browser window where we simply enter localhost 3000. Once you did that, nothing happens because we haven't configured it to return any HTML page. But if you go back to your terminal, you see a lot of output there. And that is this line. This is your request being logged to the console. Now, let's analyze what happened here in detail and what's inside this request over the next lectures. But these view lines here already give you a fully functional or almost fully functional web server. And this is how you create servers in Node.js. And I know that this can be hard to wrap your head around because it was for me when I started out with Node.js years ago. It was difficult to understand that coming from a PHP background, you suddenly write your own server. That sounded like something super complex. Well, actually, it's just these few lines, and from now on, we just will have to focus on doing something meaningful with the request and, important, sending back a response. So, time for detailed analysis in the next lectures.